In the frozen valleys of enemy territory, a battered squad of U.S. Marines trudged through knee-deep snow, their breath visible in the pre-dawn gloom. They were 23 days behind German lines, low on supplies, cut off from radio contact, and walking straight into an ambush they couldn't avoid. The silence of the valley should have been a blessing. Instead, it felt like a grave waiting to be filled. Captain Daniel Hawthorne wasn't just another battlefield officer. For nearly a decade, he had been a specialist in unconventional warfare, a Marine trained in counterinsurgency and survival against impossible odds. He had fought his way out of enemy kill zones before, but this time, something was different. The Germans weren't just lying in wait. They were afraid of something. When the first explosion tore through the snow, shrapnel and fire erupting around them, the Germans thought they had their prey. They had no idea they were about to meet something far worse than American Marines. Something that didn't just fight back, it hunted. What began as a desperate fight for survival would become a nightmarish battle against the unknown. The valley would bear witness to something neither side could explain. And in the aftermath, the Germans would come to fear a name spoken only, in hushed whispers, Karl Weiss. Because the dead were walking, and they were out for revenge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Daniel Hawthorne tasted iron in the frozen air. Blood, or maybe just the metallic edge of winter. He couldn't tell anymore. 23 days behind enemy lines had a way of blurring such distinctions. He watched his breath crystallize in the pre-dawn darkness, counting the Marines who trudged past him through knee-deep snow. 15 men left. They'd started with 38. "Sir." Lance Corporal Jack Gunner Reeves materialized beside him, his M19 19A6 machine gun cradled like a sleeping child. "Something ain't right about this valley." Hawthorne didn't respond immediately. He'd learned to trust Gunner's instincts. The man had an almost supernatural sense for trouble, but they were running out of options. Their radio had died 3 days ago. Supplies were critically low, and the temperature kept dropping. The valley ahead offered their only realistic path back to Allied lines. "Talk to me, Gunner," Hawthorne finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Too quiet." Gunner shifted the machine gun's weight. No birds, no movement, like everything living just left. He paused, steel-gray eyes scanning the tree line. "Reminds me of Guadalcanal, right before—" "Don't." Hawthorne cut him off. They'd lost too many men in the Pacific. He didn't need the reminder, not now. Doc Holloway appeared on Hawthorne's other side, medical bag hanging heavy from his shoulder. The former medical student had aged a decade in the past 3 weeks. 3 men showing early signs of trench foot, he reported quietly. "Peterson's wound is infected. We need proper shelter, and soon." Hawthorne nodded, the weight of command settling deeper into his bones. He'd seen too many good men die from the cold, from infections, from the 1,000 small betrayals of flesh and fortune that warfare brought. Each death felt like another stone in his pocket dragging him down. "Send Richards and Martinez ahead for recon," he ordered. "Standard pattern, no more than half a mile. I want—" The words died in his throat as the morning mist parted, revealing a German outpost nestled against the valley wall. No smoke from the chimneys, no sentries visible, just empty machine gun nests and a half-dozen jerry cans scattered like fallen leaves. "Check it," Hawthorne commanded. "Full precautions, could be a trap." They approached in practiced formation, weapons ready. But there was no resistance, no movement. Just the wind whistling through empty buildings and the crunch of their boots in the snow. Inside they found cold coffee cups, half-eaten meals and chairs knocked over as if the occupants had left in a hurry. Or fled. The layer of dust suggested at least a week's abandonment, but something else caught Hawthorne's attention. Scratch, marks on the walls, deep gouges in the wood. "Captain?" Gunner's voice carried from the far building. "You need to see this." The message was scrawled in dark brown across the wall, the English crude but clear. "Do not enter the valley. The dead walk." Below it, written in perfect German, Script, Aristotelicommon. He has returned. Superstitious nonsense, Hawthorne said, but his hand tightened on his Thompson. He'd seen enough of war to know that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones you couldn't see. Sir? Doc spoke softly, examining the writing. This isn't paint. His fingers came away dark red. It's blood. And it's recent. A cold wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the promise of snow. Hawthorne felt the weight of 15 pairs of eyes on him, waiting for his decision. The smart play was to find another route, to avoid whatever had spooked an entire German garrison into abandoning their post. But there was no other route, not with their supplies running low and wounded men struggling to march. Sometimes leadership meant choosing between bad options and worse ones. We move out in 10 minutes, he announced. Tight formation. Gunner, you've got rear guard. Doc, keep the wounded in the middle. Whatever happened here, we're not staying to find out. As his men prepared to move, Hawthorne caught movement in his peripheral vision. A shadow among shadows there and gone too quick to track. He raised his Thompson, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing except endless snow and darkness. Yet, somehow he knew they weren't alone. High above the valley, hidden in the gathering storm, a figure watched the Marines begin their march. Lieutenant Karl Weiss, or what remained of him, smiled faintly. The Americans were walking into a perfect trap just as planned, but the Germans waiting to spring it had no idea that their carefully laid ambush was about to become something else entirely. A reckoning. The dead were indeed walking, and they had scores to settle. The first explosion came from nowhere, a thunderclap of dirt and shrapnel that turned the morning twilight into hellfire. Private Martinez vanished in a red mist. Richards stumbled backward, clutching at his throat, already dead, but his body hadn't realized it yet. Contact! Hawthorne's warning was swallowed by the chatter of MG-42s, their distinctive sound earning them the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw. The German guns opened up from multiple positions, their intersecting fields of fire turning the valley into a killing ground. Get down! Gunner screamed, but 3 more Marines were cut down before they could react. The snow turned crimson. Beneath their falling bodies, Hawthorne's combat instincts took over. Fall back, into the trees. But even as he gave the order, he knew it was useless. The valley walls were too steep, the carefully placed mines channeling them exactly where the Germans wanted them to go. From his position on the ridgeline, Hauptmann Erich Voss watched through binoculars, a thin smile playing across his aristocratic features. Like rats in a maze, he murmured in German. Exactly as planned. Below, Hawthorne dragged a wounded Marine behind a fallen tree. Doc was already there, hands slick with blood as he worked on Peterson. Sucking chest wound, the medic reported grimly. He's not going to... Another explosion drowned out his words. Gunner, Hawthorne called out. Give us covering fire. The M19-119A6 roared to life, Gunner laying down suppressive fire in controlled bursts. But the German positions were too well fortified. Every time they tried to move, another mine would detonate or sniper fire would pin them down. We're being herded, Hawthorne realized. Each explosion, each burst of gunfire was pushing them deeper into the valley, toward what looked like a natural bottleneck. The perfect kill zone. Through the chaos, something caught his eye. Movement in the German lines, but wrong somehow. A figure in Wehrmacht gear was moving with impossible precision, as if it knew exactly where each German soldier would be. One by one, German machine gun positions fell silent. What the hell? Gunner had seen it too. The figure moved like a ghost through the German defenses, each motion efficient and lethal. No wasted movement, no hesitation. Voss lowered his binoculars, his smile fading. Impossible, he whispered. Then louder, impossible. He grabbed his radio operator. Who is that? Where are they coming from? The figure emerged from the smoke, stepping over German bodies. His uniform was a patchwork of scavenged Wehrmacht gear, his face partially obscured by a weathered Stahlhelm. But his eyes burned with something that made even Gunner Take a step back. Weiss. Voss breathed the name like a curse. You're dead. I killed you myself. The figure, Weiss, moved toward the Marines with the same methodical precision he'd shown while cutting through the German lines. His hands were red to the elbows, but his voice was unnaturally calm. The eastern path is clear now. 300 meters. Move fast. Hawthorne hesitated. The man had just saved them, but something about him felt wrong. Inhuman. Like looking at a wolf wearing human skin. Why should we trust you? Gunner demanded, his machine gun shifting slightly toward Weiss. Because, Weiss replied without emotion, in 3 minutes, their mortars will zero in on this position. And because I know exactly what Voss has planned. Next. He turned to Hawthorne. You led your men into a trap, Captain. Let me lead them out. Another explosion rocked the valley. Doc looked up from Peterson's now still body. Sir, we're losing men every minute we stay here. Hawthorne studied Weiss's face, trying to read the truth in those burning eyes. But there was nothing there to read, just an emptiness that spoke of something worse than death. Move out, Hawthorne ordered finally. Gunner, you keep watching our new friend. One wrong move. I expect nothing less, Weiss said, already moving. But remember, Captain, I'm not the monster you need to fear in this valley. Above them, Voss was already issuing new orders, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Bring up the reserves. I want them cut off before they reach the tunnels and find out how Weiss survived. I want to know what we're dealing with. His aide cleared his throat nervously. Sir, the men, they're saying things. About what happened. To Lieutenant Weiss. About the experiments. Shut up, Voss snapped. Just make sure he doesn't reach the old bunker, whatever it takes. The Marines followed Weiss through the killing ground, staying low, moving fast. But Hawthorne couldn't shake the feeling that they were still in a trap, just a different one now. Every so often, Weiss would stop, head cocked as if listening to something no one else could hear, then change direction slightly. Sir, Gunner, whispered during one such pause. This ain't natural, the way he moves, the way he found it. What is he? Hawthorne watched Weiss's back, remembering the blood-scrawled warning from the abandoned outpost. The dead walk. I don't know, Gunner, he admitted quietly. But right now, he's all we've got. The eastern path led them to a shallow cave, barely more than an overhang in the valley wall. 8 Marines had made it this far. 7 others lay scattered behind them in the blood-stained snow, their bodies already disappearing under fresh powder. Hawthorne fought down the bile rising in his throat. He'd led them into this. Their deaths were on him. Weiss stood at the cave's entrance, his posture unnaturally still. Snow gathered on his shoulders, not melting despite his body heat, if he even had any. They will sweep this area in exactly 17 minutes, he announced, his German accent barely detectable. 3 teams, 2 from the north, 1 from the south. They will find nothing. Gunner's patience finally snapped. The machine gunner surged forward, pressing his Colt 45 against Weiss's temple. How do you know that? Who the hell are you? Weiss didn't flinch. He turned slowly, meeting Gunner's eyes with that same empty stare. I know because I wrote the protocol myself, when I was Hauptmann Voss's tactical officer. A kraut, Gunner spat. I knew it. Give me one reason I shouldn't pull this trigger. Because, Weiss replied calmly. In 16 minutes now you will all die without me. Voss has positioned his best sniper team in the ruins of an old hunting blind, 300 meters up the ridge. His second squad carries flamethrowers. They'll flush you out while the third team cuts off your retreat. He paused. Would you like to know how many seconds it takes a man to die by fire, Corporal Reeves? The use of Gunner's rank and name, which none of them had told him, sent a chill through the group. Doc spoke up from where he was treating a wounded Marine. How did you? I know everything about this valley, Weiss cut him off. Every tunnel, every sight line, every killing ground. I spent 6 months designing this trap. It's perfect. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Perfect for us to use against them. Hawthorne stepped forward. You said Voss betrayed you, left you for dead. Yes. For the first time, emotion crept into Weiss's voice, a cold rage that made the temperature seem to drop further. They needed someone to test their theories on, someone expendable. The perfect soldier, they said. One who could think like the enemy because he had been the enemy. His hand moved to his chest, touching something beneath his uniform. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Sir, Gunner's finger tightened on the trigger. We can't trust him. Whatever he is, whatever they did to him. He's not natural. 14 minutes, Weiss announced. Choose now, Captain Hawthorne. Trust the devil you know, or face the ones waiting in the storm. Hawthorne studied the German's face. There was something there, beneath the emptiness, a burning purpose that went beyond mere survival. You're not helping us out of kindness. No, Weiss agreed. I'm helping you because Voss needs to learn that some weapons can't be controlled. Some deaths don't take. A distant explosion made them all duck instinctively. German voices carried on the wind, growing closer. 13 minutes, Weiss continued. The tunnels beneath us connect to an old mining complex. The Germans don't know about the Western Junction. They think that section collapsed last winter. I can lead you through, or you can stay here and die. Your choice, Captain. Hawthorne looked at his remaining men. Doc, trying to keep Roberts alive despite a gut wound. Gunner, his face twisted with distrust, but his hands steady on his weapon. The others, exhausted, frozen, but still looking to him for leadership. Sometimes command meant choosing between bad options and worse ones. Lower your weapon, Gunner, he ordered, but keep it ready. Sir, do it. Hawthorne turned to Weiss. You lead us out, you fight with us, you follow my orders. In return, we help you get to Voss. That's the deal. Weiss nodded once, sharply. The deal is made. But remember, Captain, I follow your orders only as long as they lead me to Voss. After that, he left the threat unspoken. 11 minutes, he added, already moving toward the back of the cave. His hands found a section of rock that looked no different from any other, but at his touch it swung inward, revealing a dark passage. The dead places remember me. They know their own. One by one, the Marines entered the tunnel. Gunner went last, his pistol still trained on Weiss's back. I'll be watching you, Kraut. One wrong move. You'll kill me? Weiss's laugh held no humor. Better men than you have tried, Corporal. Now move. The darkness is waiting. As they descended into the earth, Hawthorne couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just made a deal with something far worse than a devil. But up above, German boots crunched in the snow, and Voss's men began their sweep of the valley. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and their own weapon was coming home to roost. The tunnels swallowed them like a living thing. Their boots echoed on stone worn smooth by years of use, the sound bouncing back distorted, wrong. Hawthorne's flashlight beam caught glimpses of ancient timber supports, water-stained walls, and something else, markings carved deep into the rock. Weiss moved through the darkness as if he could see perfectly, occasionally muttering in German. 7 Meter nach links. Ja, hier ist es. 7 meters left. Yes, here it is. He's mapping it out. Doc whispered to Hawthorne. But these tunnels, they're older than the war, much older. A distant explosion above made dust rain down. The Germans were sealing the exits, trying to trap them. The sound traveled strangely through the stone, like someone whispering in their ears. Cache ahead, Weiss announced suddenly. Your men will need ammunition. The supply room was tucked behind a partially collapsed wall. Crates of German ammunition, medical supplies, and rations lay stacked in neat rows. Too neat. As if they'd been left deliberately. Why would they abandon all this? Gunner demanded, checking the crates. These ain't even old supplies. Some of these dates, this was left here recently. Because, Weiss replied, his voice taking on an odd tone. They were meant for me. He ran his hand along one of the crates. They know I'm still here, still hunting. Roberts, the wounded Marine, groaned as Doc changed his bandages. The sound echoed oddly, coming back wrong, like laughter. "Sir," one of the remaining Marines, Johnson, called out softly. His flashlight beam had caught something on the wall, symbols carved deep into the stone. They looked military at first glance, unit designations maybe, but there was something off about them. "These aren't standard German markings," Hawthorne said, studying them closer. "No." Weiss's voice was distant. "There's something else, something older. The men who dug these tunnels, they knew what lived down here." He touched one of the symbols. "They tried to contain it." "Contain what?" Gunnar challenged, but Weiss had already moved on. The tunnels grew narrower as they pressed deeper, the air becoming thick and stale. They passed more signs of recent German presence: spent cartridges, bloodstains, a helmet with a neat hole punched through it. "They're afraid to come down here," Doc observed, his medical training making him notice details others missed. "Look at these bullet patterns. They were firing at shadows." A skeleton lay propped against one wall, wearing the remnants of a World War I uniform. Its bony fingers still clutched a Mauser rifle, pointing down the tunnel as if in warning. "Weiss," Hawthorne called out softly, "what really happened to you down here?" Before the German could answer, a sound echoed through the tunnels, boots on stone, accompanied by ragged breathing. Everyone froze. The wounded German soldier stumbled into their flashlight beams. His uniform was torn, covered in dirt and blood. His eyes were wide with terror. Nein, bitte," he mumbled, raising his hands. "Ist hier. Kommt. He's here. He's coming." Weiss stepped forward and the soldier's eyes went wider. "Unmöglich," he whispered. "Du bist tot. Ich habe deine Leiche gesehen." "Impossible. You're dead. I saw your corpse." "Ja," Weiss replied simply. "You did?" The soldier's hand moved to his sidearm, but instead of aiming at the Marines, he pressed the barrel under his own chin. "You shouldn't be here," he said in broken English. "He's still down here, still hunting, still—" The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. The soldier crumpled, a look of relief on his face as death took him. "Jesus Christ," Gunnar breathed. Weiss knelt by the body, searching it efficiently. He removed a set of orders, reading them quickly. "Voss knows we're down here. He sealed the northern exits." A pause. "And he's sending in the Brandenburgers." "The what?" Johnson asked. "Special forces," Hawthorne explained grimly. "Commandos." "It doesn't matter," Weiss said, standing. "They won't find us. The tunnels remember me. They know their own." He cocked his head suddenly, like a predator catching a scent. "We are not alone down here." The sound came again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from the darkness ahead. But this time, they were accompanied by something else. The soft scrape of metal on stone, like a blade being drawn across the tunnel wall. Weiss's eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. Someone else remembers these tunnels too. The footsteps in the darkness had led them to something worse than any nightmare. Their flashlight beams revealed an old German encampment, but the scene before them defied explanation. A dozen soldiers sat at their posts, perfectly preserved by the cold, weapons still gripped in frozen hands. Their faces were masks of terror, but there wasn't a mark on them. No wounds, no signs of struggle. They had simply stopped. They died of fear. Doc whispered, his medical training warring with what his eyes were telling him. Their hearts just gave out. They were afraid, Weiss confirmed, moving through the dead with disturbing familiarity. They had reason to be. Hawthorne studied the bodies. Their uniforms were relatively recent, maybe 3 months old. But something caught his eye. A patch on one of the corpses. These were Voss's men. His first search party, Weiss nodded, sent to recover something valuable. His voice took on an edge. They found it. Before Hawthorne could question further, the sound of boots on stone echoed through the tunnels. German voices approached. Rapidly, they'd found one of the entrances. "Positions!" Hawthorne hissed. His Marines moved with practiced efficiency, using the dead Germans as cover. A bitter irony not lost on any of them. The firefight, when it came, was pure chaos. Muzzle. Flashes turned the tunnel into a strobe light nightmare. Gunners' M1919 chattered in controlled bursts, the sound deafening in the confined space. German MP40s answered, their lighter reports almost lost in the din. But it was Weiss who turned the tide. He moved through the darkness like a ghost, appearing behind German positions that should have been secure, his knife finding throats with surgical precision. Each kill was silent, efficient, personal. Gunner found himself fighting alongside the German, their movements somehow synchronized. "Left!" Weiss called out in perfect English, and Gunner swung his machine gun just in time to cut down 3 Germans rushing their position. "Thanks," Gunner grunted, surprised to find himself meaning it. "Don't thank me yet," Weiss replied, and there was something in his voice that made Gunner's skin crawl. The Germans fell back, leaving their dead behind. But victory was short-lived. Doc's voice cut through the powder smoke. "Captain, you need to see this." The medic stood over one of the bodies in the old encampment, his flashlight beam illuminating something that couldn't be possible. The corpse wore a lieutenant's uniform, and the dog tags around its neck read, "Weiss, Karl." The face, though frozen in death, was unmistakable. Every Marine's weapon swung toward Weiss, who stood calmly in the darkness. "What the hell are you?" Hawthorne demanded. "They thought they killed me," Weiss said simply, looking down at his own corpse. "They weren't wrong." He touched the dead face with something almost like tenderness. But death had other plans. Before anyone could respond, new voices echoed through the tunnel. A commanding voice called out in German, "Forward, find them." "Hauser." Weiss's expression changed for the first time, raw hatred replacing his usual emptiness. "Voss's loyal dog." The second wave hit them like a hammer. Lieutenant Hauser led. From the front, his men pressing the attack with fearless efficiency. In the chaos of close-quarters combat, friend and foe became indistinguishable shadows. Doc found himself cornered, a German soldier's bayonet inches from his throat. But then Weiss was there, moving faster than should be possible. He snapped the German's neck with mechanical precision. "I need you alive," Weiss told Doc matter-of-factly. "All of you. For now." The fight became a swirling nightmare of muzzle flashes and screams. Hawthorne lost track of who was shooting at whom. But through it all, Weiss moved with terrifying purpose, as if he could see perfectly in the darkness. Hauser's voice cut through the chaos. Fall back to the upper tunnel." The Germans retreated in good order, leaving their dead behind. Again. When silence finally fell, Hawthorne did a quick count. All his remaining Marines were alive, though Johnson had taken a grazing wound. "They'll seal this section next," Weiss announced, already moving. "We need to reach the eastern exit before—" He stopped suddenly, head cocked. "No, they're already there, waiting." "Then we're trapped," Gunner said. "No." Weiss's smile was terrible to behold. "They are." He moved to what appeared to be a solid rock wall and pressed something. A hidden door swung open with a grinding sound. "This way. We're about to give Voss a surprise." Hawthorne looked at his men, then at the corpse wearing Weiss's face, then at Weiss himself. Whatever they were following wasn't human. Maybe never had been, but they were out of options. "Move out," he ordered. But as they filed through the hidden door, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't escaping the trap. They were walking right into it. The hidden door opened directly into hell. Floodlights snapped on, turning night into harsh day, exposing the Marines in a cruel crossfire killing zone. German MG-42s covered every angle of escape, their gunners' fingers tense on triggers. At the center of it all stood Hauptmann Voss, his aristocratic features twisted in a triumphant smile. Until he saw Weiss. The color drained from Voss's face. His hand went to his collar, loosening it as if he couldn't breathe. "Unmöglich," he whispered. Then louder. Impossible. The German soldiers shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves. Some made the sign of the cross. Others took involuntary steps backward. They knew. They all knew. Drop your weapons, Voss commanded in accented English, but his eyes never left Weiss. Now. Hawthorne's Thompson fell into the snow. Around him, his Marines followed suit, their faces grim. All except Gunner, who kept his grip on the M1919. Interesting setup, Weiss said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. The floodlights are new. The rest, he gestured at the German positions, exactly where I would have put them, where I did put them once. You were dead, Carl. Voss's voice shook slightly. I saw your body. We all did. Weiss's smile was terrible to behold. You should have made sure. He took a step forward, and every German gun followed him. Remember what you said that night, Herr Hauptmann? The perfect soldier cannot fear death. Well, he spread his arms wide. Here I am, your perfect soldier. This is impossible, Voss repeated, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. The experiment failed. You died. Did I? Weiss's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried across the entire camp. Or did you just make me better at it? Voss regained some of his composure. It doesn't matter. You're outnumbered, surrounded. He gestured at the Marines. Surrender now and I'll spare the wounded. Fight, and they all die. Hawthorne tensed, reading the situation. Something was wrong. Weiss was too calm, too prepared. An interesting offer, Weiss replied. Let me make a counter-proposal. His hand moved to his chest, touching something beneath his uniform. Did you check the fuel depot before setting up your ambush? The ammunition bunker? The command post? His smile widened. The ground beneath your feet? Voss's eyes widened in sudden understanding. No. Weiss's hand emerged, holding a simple detonator. Boom, he whispered. The first explosion turned the fuel depot into a miniature sun. The second collapsed the ammunition bunker, sending German soldiers flying like rag dolls. The third erupted directly beneath an MG-42 nest, throwing men and machinery into the air. Now! Hawthorne shouted. His Marines were moving before the word finished, diving for their weapons as chaos erupted. Gunner's machine gun roared to life, cutting down Germans trying to regroup. Doc dragged the wounded behind cover. Johnson and the others formed a defensive perimeter, their training taking over despite the insanity around them. But Weiss was something else entirely. He moved through the carnage like a ghost, each step precise, each kill methodical. German officers died first, their throats opened by his knife, before they could issue orders. Then the NCOs, picked off with terrifying efficiency. He wasn't just killing them. He was dismantling their command structure, turning organized resistance into panic. Mein Gott, a German soldier screamed. Ist nicht menschlich. He's not human. Voss was already running, his surviving officers forming a protective circle around him. But Weiss's voice followed him into the darkness. Run, Herr Hauptmann. Run like you made me run. The hunt is just beginning. Captain! Gunner's voice cut through the chaos. We need to move, now! Hawthorne nodded, gathering his men. The German camp was consuming itself in flames, survivors fleeing in all directions. But Weiss wasn't following them toward safety. He was pursuing Voss's retreating group, his movements taking on an almost predatory grace. Sir, Gunner said quietly as they reached the tree line. What the hell did we just see? Hawthorne watched Weiss disappear into the darkness, hunting his prey. I don't think we were ever rescuing him, Gunner. We were just releasing him. Behind them, the German camp burned, its flames painting the snow blood red. Somewhere in the darkness, Weiss was still hunting. And Hawthorne knew with cold certainty that this was only the beginning. The dead man's war was just getting started. The cold had teeth, It bit through their uniforms, gnawed at their bones, turned every breath into a knife in their lungs. The Marines stumbled through knee-deep snow, leaving trails of blood and sweat that froze almost instantly. They'd been moving for 6 hours straight, and even the strongest among them were starting to falter. All except Weiss. He pushed them relentlessly forward, never tiring, never slowing. The cold seemed to energize him, as if the bitter winter recognized one of its own. 5 minutes, Hawthorne called out, seeing Johnson stumble again. We need to rest. No. Weiss didn't even turn around. They're getting closer. Elite mountain troops, Jaegers. They know these forests better than you know your own homes. Our men are dying, Doc managed through chattering teeth. His medical bag seemed to grow heavier with each step. We can't. Then they die. Weiss cut him off. But they die moving forward. Something in Gunnar finally snapped. He grabbed Weiss's shoulder, spinning him around. Where the hell are you leading us? More tunnels, more traps, what's your game? For a moment, Hawthorne thought Weiss might kill Gunnar right there. The German's eyes had that empty, predatory look they got before violence erupted. But instead, Weiss simply pointed to a ridge ahead. There's a supply bunker 2 kilometers north. Hidden. Forgotten. Even Voss doesn't know about it. His breath didn't steam in the cold air. We'll be safe there. Safe? Gunnar laughed bitterly. Like we were safe in the tunnels? Like we were safe in the camp? You're alive, aren't you? Weiss's voice carried an edge. That's more than most can say after meeting Voss. A crack split the air, a rifle shot. Johnson jerked backward, blood spraying from his shoulder. Contact, Hawthorne shouted, but Weiss was already moving. Jaegers, he confirmed grimly. Right, on schedule. The firefight erupted with devastating suddenness. The German mountain troops seemed to materialize from the forest itself, their white winter gear making them nearly invisible against the snow. These weren't regular infantry. Their movements were precise, coordinated, lethal. Doc caught a bullet trying to reach Johnson. The medic went down hard, clutching his side. Captain, he called out weakly. Hawthorne faced an impossible choice. Stop to help their wounded and risk being overrun, or press forward and leave them to die in the snow. But Weiss had other plans. He emerged from the trees dragging a wounded Jaeger. The German soldier couldn't have been more than 20. His face twisted in terror as Weiss forced him to his knees. Watch, Weiss commanded in that emotionless voice. Then, with mechanical precision, he drew his knife across the young soldier's throat. Jesus Christ! Gunnar raised his machine gun, but Weiss was already moving. Wait, Weiss ordered. Watch what happens next. The Jaegers had stopped firing. In the sudden silence, they could hear urgent German voices conferring. Then, predictably, they broke cover to retrieve their fallen comrade. Weiss's trap was perfect. The Marines' combined fire cut down 6 Jaegers in seconds. The rest fell back in confusion, their careful attack broken. Move, Weiss commanded. Carry your wounded. The bunker is close now. Doc stared at the dead Jaeger as Hawthorne helped him up. You knew, the medic accused Weiss. You knew they'd try to save him. Of course. Weiss's smile was terrible. They're still human. That makes them predictable. He paused. That makes them weak. They pressed on through the gathering darkness. The wounded struggled to keep up, leaving crimson trails in the pristine snow. Hawthorne felt the weight of command crushing him. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into something he couldn't understand, couldn't control. Sir, Gunnar whispered during a brief pause to check their bearings. Whatever Weiss is, he ain't just some defector. You've seen how he moves, how he thinks. It's like... He struggled for words. They found us, Johnson reported from his lookout position. But they're not attacking. They're setting up positions. Hawthorne moved to the entrance, peering carefully out. Through his binoculars, he could make out Voss himself directing his men with practiced efficiency. But instead of preparing an assault, they were establishing a perimeter. They're not trying to get in, Hawthorne realized with growing dread. They're making sure we can't get out. A mechanical whirring sound filled the bunker, ventilation fans spinning up, and with them came a familiar, bitter almond smell that made Doc's eyes go wide. "Gas!" he shouted. "They're flooding the bunker!" But from behind the locked door, Weiss's laughter echoed through the chambers. This was what he'd been waiting for all along. The gas crept through the bunker like a living thing, its bitter almond sweetness coating their tongues, burning their eyes. Marines scrambled to cover their faces with whatever they could find. Uniform shirts, bandages, anything to filter the poisoned air. "Outside!" Hawthorne ordered through his makeshift mask, fighting the urge to vomit. "Move! Move!" But the main entrance was already sealed. Heavy steel doors dropped into place with mechanical finality. The sound of Voss's laughter carried through the ventilation system. "Did you think I wouldn't remember the containment protocols, Carl?" The German commander's voice was distorted but triumphant. "This bunker was designed to keep things in, not out. You taught me that." Doc worked frantically to help the wounded, but his medical training told him they had minutes at most. The gas was military grade, hydrogen cyanide mixed with something else, something worse. "Weiss!" Gunner's rage finally exploded. He staggered through the thickening gas toward where the German stood calmly in the center of the room. "You led us here. You knew this would happen." Weiss didn't even blink as Gunner pressed the .45 against his temple. The gas seemed to swirl around him but never touch him, as if even poison knew better than to try. "Of course I knew," he replied. Simply. "Just like I know about the secondary ventilation system, the emergency exits, the way the gas circulation was designed." His empty smile widened. "Who do you think designed it?" "You son of a—" Gunner's finger tightened on the trigger. "Wait!" Hawthorne's command was interrupted by coughing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Weiss replied, "that this bunker has another purpose. The gas isn't just meant to kill, it's meant to be collected. Weaponized." He touched the wall, fingers finding hidden catches. A panel slid open, revealing a complex network of pipes and valves. "They used it in the experiments, on me. Now." That terrible smile again. "Now we can use it on them." "Jesus Christ," Doc whispered, understanding dawning. "You want to reverse the ventilation flow. Push the gas out through the external vents. Right into their positions." Weiss confirmed. "They'll never expect it. Voss thinks he knows all my tricks. He forgot who taught them to him." Gunner's gun hand shook. "You're talking about using poison gas on them. There are lines we don't cross." "Lines?" Weiss laughed, and the sound made them all flinch. "Look around you, Corporal. Look what they're doing to you right now. War isn't about lines. It's about survival." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Voss made me what I am. In that laboratory, in that mass grave, he forged his perfect weapon. Let's show him how perfect." Hawthorne fought to think through the gas-induced haze. His men were dying. The only way out was through the German lines, and Weiss was offering them a way. "How long?" he managed. 3 minutes to reconfigure the system. 2 more for the gas to reach lethal concentration outside. Weiss's voice was clinically detached. "We'll need masks. There are spares in the storage room. The Germans own equipment from when they ran their experiments." "Sir," Gunner pleaded, "we can't. This isn't just killing. This is survival." Weiss cut him off. "This is war. This is what Voss wanted me to become." For the first time, real emotion crept into his voice. A cold, terrible rage. "He made me. Now let's unmake him." A Marine collapsed, convulsing. Doc tried to help, but stumbled, the gas affecting his coordination. They were out of time. "Do it," Hawthorne ordered, the words burning his throat like acid. "Get the masks. Rig the system." Weiss moved with mechanical efficiency, his fingers dancing over valves and controls. The ventilation system groaned as he reversed its flow, turning the bunker's defensive measures into a weapon. Sir, Gunner's voice was barely a whisper now. We can't trust him. Whatever he is, he's not human anymore. Hawthorne watched Weiss work, remembering the photographs, the surgical tables, the mass grave. No, he agreed quietly. He's what they made him. God help us all. Outside, Voss's men maintained their positions, believing they held all the cards. They never saw the death coming up from below. They never understood that their perfect trap had just become their perfect tomb. The gas began to rise. The gas had turned the bunker into a killing jar, every breath bringing them closer to death. Through burning eyes, Hawthorne watched Weiss work at the detonator panel, his movements precise despite the poisoned air. The German hadn't bothered with a mask, as if he had no need to breathe at all. The explosives are set, Weiss announced, his voice carrying that same mechanical calm. When the charges blow, they'll rupture the main gas lines. The pressure will force everything upward, right into their positions. He turned to face them, and in the sickly emergency lighting, his eyes seemed to glow. But someone needs to stay. The timing must be perfect. You're volunteering, Gunner managed through his mask, his voice thick with suspicion. How convenient. Would you prefer to do it, Corporal? Weiss's smile was terrible to behold. I've already died once. It doesn't hold much fear anymore. A Marine collapsed, blood streaming from his eyes. Doc struggled to help him up, but the gas was affecting everyone now. Everyone except Weiss. The exit tunnel leads to a maintenance shaft. Weiss continued, indicating a narrow passage. 300 meters to the surface. When you reach the top, head north. The gas will flow south following the valley's natural contours. This is a trick, Gunner insisted, swaying on his feet. You'll seal us in that tunnel, kill us all? If I wanted you dead, Weiss cut him off. I'd simply wait 5 more minutes. Now move. Time is running out. Hawthorne made the call. Go, everyone out. Now. They stumbled into the passage, helping the wounded, fighting for every step. Behind them, Weiss's voice carried one last message. Remember, Captain. Survive. First, hate me later. The tunnel seemed endless. Their flashlight beams bounced off rough-hewn walls, creating twisted shadows that looked like reaching hands. The gas followed them, its bitter taste lingering even through the masks. Finally, mercifully, they reached the surface. The night. Air hit them like a physical blow, clean and sharp and cold. But there was no time to celebrate. German voices carried through the trees. Voss's men had spotted them. The firefight erupted in a chaos of muzzle flashes and screaming. Gunner's M1919 roared to life, providing covering fire as the Marines scrambled for position. Somewhere in the darkness, Voss was shouting orders in German. Then the earth itself seemed to explode. The blast caught everyone by surprise, Germans and Marines alike thrown to the ground as the bunker's charges detonated. But it wasn't the explosion that brought true horror. It was what came after. The gas erupted from every vent, every crack in the earth, a pale green demon clawing its way from hell. It rolled down the valley like a living thing, hungry for breath, hungry for life. German soldiers tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Their screams turned to choking gasps as the poison found them. Some clawed at their throats, others fired blindly into the mist, terror replacing training. Through it all, Voss stood on the ridgeline, watching his perfect trap become his men's tomb. 9, he whispered. This isn't possible. The fail-safes failed. The voice came from the gas itself. Weiss emerged like a ghost, his uniform untouched by the poison around him. Just like you failed, Herr Hauptmann. Just like you failed to kill me. Karl, Voss managed, reaching for his pistol. What have you become? Exactly what you wanted. Weiss's laugh was lost in the sound of dying men. Your perfect soldier. The gas swallowed them both. From their position on higher ground, the Marines watched in horrified fascination. The valley had become a graveyard, filled with the bodies of German soldiers who had succumbed to their own weapon. Sir, Gunner's voice shook slightly. How did he survive? The explosion, the gas? I don't think he did survive. Hawthorne replied quietly. Not really. Not that night in the mass grave. Whatever walks in his skin now. He left the thought unfinished. A figure appeared through the thinning gas, Weiss, moving with that same unnatural grace. But Voss was nowhere to be seen. "We should move," Weiss announced calmly, as if he hadn't just orchestrated a massacre. "The gas will linger in the low ground for hours. Voss is still alive, wounded but alive." That empty smile again. The hunt isn't over. Hawthorne looked at his men, exhausted, traumatized, but alive. They had survived, but at what cost? And what would they become following this thing that wore a man's face? The gas continued to roll through the valley, carrying with it the promise of more death to come. The war had created a monster, and now that monster was loose. Heaven help them all. The forest had turned against them. Every shadow held a potential killer, every sound a possible threat. The Marines moved like wounded animals, exhausted and paranoid, jumping at the crack of frozen branches and the whisper of wind through dead leaves. Hawthorne led them on instinct now, his combat experience telling him to keep to high ground, to use the terrain to their advantage. But the cold was winning. The gas attack had left them weak, their lungs burning with every breath of frozen air. "Sir," Doc's voice was barely a whisper. The medic stumbled, blood seeping through his makeshift bandages. The bullet wound he'd taken earlier had reopened. "I can't." They found the cabin just as Doc collapsed completely. It was an old forester's shelter, half buried in snow, its windows dark and uninviting. But they had no choice. "Check it," Hawthorne ordered. Quick and quiet. Inside, they found evidence of recent occupation. Cold coffee cups, cigarette butts, a map left open on a rough wooden table. German equipment, but no Germans. "Get Doc stabilized," Hawthorne commanded. "Johnson, Cooper, watch the approaches. Anything moves out there, I want to know." Gunner stood at a window, his machine gun ready but his eyes distant. "He's not dead," the corporal said suddenly. "Weiss. No way he died in that explosion." "You saw what happened," Hawthorne replied, but even he didn't believe it. How could Weiss be dead when he was already a walking corpse? "Sir," Cooper's urgent whisper cut through the darkness. "We've got movement. Southeast." They doused the lantern, watching through frosted windows as shapes moved through the trees. German soldiers, but something was wrong about their formation. They moved too carefully, too afraid. A scream split the night. Short, terrible, cut off suddenly. Then another. "Jesus," Johnson breathed. "They're dying out there." Through his binoculars, Hawthorne watched the Germans' disciplined advance dissolve into panic. Soldiers fired at shadows at nothing, their shouts carrying clearly through the still air. "Ist hier!" One voice rose above the others. "Das Monster kommt!" "The monster is coming." More screams, more silence. Then they found the messages, carved into trees with mechanical precision. The German words formed a trail leading right to their position. "I see you, Voss. Are you afraid yet? The dead are patient." "Sir." Gunner's voice shook slightly. "We need to move, now." But before they could act, the cabin's door burst open. A German officer stumbled in, blood streaming from a dozen precise cuts. His eyes were wild with terror. "Bitte," he gasped. "Bitte. Help!" He made it 2 steps before collapsing. His throat had been opened with surgical precision, the cut, so clean it didn't even bleed until he fell. "Fresh kill," Doc managed through his pain. "Whoever did this, they're right outside." The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a hungry wolf. Snow began to fall, thick and fast, nature conspiring to trap them in this killing ground. "Hawthorne," a voice carried through the storm, Voss, somewhere in the darkness. "I know you can hear me. Your pet monster thinks he's hunting us, but he's wrong. I made him, I can unmake him." A shadow moved past the window, too quick to track, too deliberate to be natural. The Marines raised their weapons, but what good were bullets against something that didn't die? "Contact front," Johnson's warning was cut short as something crashed through the window beside him. But it wasn't a German soldier. Weiss stood in the broken window frame, snow gathering on his shoulders, his uniform decorated with fresh blood. His eyes held that same empty light they'd seen in the bunker. "We need to move," he announced calmly, as if he hadn't just disappeared in a gas explosion hours ago. "Voss is coming, and this time..." A smile that hadn't seen humor in a long time. "This time he's bringing something special." Gunner's finger tightened on his trigger. "Give us one reason not to shoot you right now." "Because," Weiss replied simply, "in exactly 30 seconds this cabin will be hit by mortar fire, and I'm the only one who knows where they won't be aiming next." As if on cue, the distinctive sound of mortar tubes firing carried through the storm. "Choose quickly," Weiss added as the shells began to fall. "Death comes in many forms tonight, but only one of them is on your side." The first explosion lit up the night like false dawn, and the hunt began again. The mortar shells turned the world white. Snow and shrapnel filled the air as the cabin disintegrated around them, but Weiss was already moving. He grabbed Doc with inhuman strength, dragging both the medic and his patient toward a root cellar door that none of them had noticed. "Down," he commanded, his voice carrying even through the explosions. "Now!" They tumbled into darkness just as the cabin collapsed. Through the underground darkness they heard German voices approaching, boots crunching on fresh snow and splintered wood. Then Weiss did something none of them expected. He collapsed. The German went down hard, his body convulsing, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. For the first time he looked almost human. Almost. "Help him," Hawthorne ordered, surprising himself. But they needed Weiss, whatever he was, at least for now. Doc hesitated only a moment before moving to examine their unlikely savior. The medic's hands moved with professional efficiency, but his face showed growing confusion. "This isn't possible," he whispered. "His body temperature is below 70 degrees. No heartbeat, no pulse, but he's moving, talking." "You don't understand," Weiss managed through bloody teeth. "Death isn't what you think it is. It's not an end. It's a door." His eyes found Hawthorne's in the darkness. "And some doors don't close properly." "How did you survive the gas?" Hawthorne demanded. "The explosion?" "You don't kill a ghost, Captain." Weiss's laugh turned into a wet cough. "You can only point it in the right direction." Above them, German boots moved in practiced patterns. Voss's voice carried clearly. "Find them, they're here somewhere. The monster always returns to familiar ground." Gunner's finger tightened on his trigger. "They're going to find this cellar. We need to move." "No." Weiss pulled himself to his feet, his movements jerky, wrong. "We don't run, not anymore." Something shifted in his eyes, a deeper darkness replacing the usual emptiness. "We hunt." "Hunt?" Cooper whispered. "There's a platoon up there." "Good odds," Weiss replied, and for a moment they saw what he truly was. Not a man, not anymore, but something that had crawled out of death's own trenches. They're afraid now, confused. They've lost their night vision from the explosions. They're bunching up, seeking safety in numbers. His smile was terrible to behold. "Perfect." Hawthorne studied their position. The cellar had multiple exits, probably designed for smuggling during earlier wars. And Weiss was right. The Germans above were moving like scared men, not soldiers. "What's your plan?" "We split up. 3 teams. I've already rigged the area with charges. Old habits." Weiss's movements were becoming smoother, more predatory. "We drive them toward the creek bed. The ice won't hold their weight. Those who don't drown will be easy targets." "Jesus," Johnson breathed. "You really are a monster." "Yes." Weiss didn't even blink. "That's what they made me. That's what they wanted." For just a moment something like fear crossed his face. But even monsters can choose their targets. Gunner spoke up. "Sir, we can't trust him. Whatever brought him back, whatever..." He is now. He's not on our side. I'm not on anyone's side, Corporal. Weiss checked his weapons with mechanical precision. I'm just here to finish what Voss started. You can help, or you can die. Your choice. A German grenade bounced down one of the cellar entrances. Weiss caught it casually and threw it back up. The explosion was followed by screams. Choose quickly, he added. The night won't last forever. Hawthorne looked at his men, wounded, exhausted, but still fighting. Then at Weiss, this thing that wore a dead man's face. Sometimes survival meant making deals with devils. We do. This smart, he ordered. Teams of 2. Doc, you're with me. Gunner, take Johnson. Cooper, you're with our friend. He met Weiss's empty eyes. Any of my men die, and whatever you are, whatever you've become, I'll find a way to end you. Understood? Perfectly. Weiss was already moving toward one of the exits, his movements taking on that familiar predatory grace. Remember, fear is a weapon. Use it. They split up, melting into the snowy darkness. The hunters were about to become the hunted. But as they moved into position, Hawthorne couldn't shake a terrible certainty. They weren't just following a ghost into battle. They were following it straight to hell. The night belonged to the dead man now. Weiss moved through the darkness like something from an ancient nightmare, each kill more precise, more artful, more terrible than the last. The Germans never saw him coming. They only saw their comrades disappearing one by one into the shadows, heard the soft whisper of a knife across throat after throat. Gunner watched through his scope as Weiss approached his latest target, a German radio man trying desperately to call for reinforcements. The corporal's finger tightened on his trigger, ready to take the shot, but something held him back. A morbid fascination, a need to understand what they'd allied themselves with. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Weiss's attack was beautiful in its horror. He moved like liquid shadow, flowing around the Germans' defensive fire as if the bullets were moving through molasses. His hands found the soldier's neck, and then, Jesus Christ, Gunner whispered, turning away. But he couldn't unhear the sound of vertebrae separating, couldn't unsee the look of pure joy on Weiss's face as he killed. Keep watching, Hawthorne ordered from his position nearby, his voice tight. We need to understand what we're dealing with. The Marines' part of the ambush was clinical, professional, aimed shots, controlled bursts, clean kills when necessary. But Weiss was turning the forest into an art gallery of death. Each body was posed, arranged, left as a message for Voss to find. Fall back. Voss's voice carried through the trees, edged with something none of his men had ever heard before: fear. Defensive positions. Fall back to... A German soldier stumbled into their line of sight, clutching his radio handset like a lifeline. They're everywhere, he screamed in German. It's not human, it's not... Weiss emerged from the shadows behind him. Grüß Gott, he whispered, almost tenderly. Then his hands moved, and the soldier's scream became a gurgle. But this time was different. This time Weiss didn't stop when the man was dead. He kept going, his movements becoming almost choreographed, turning murder into meditation. Sir, Cooper's voice crackled through their field radio. We need to stop him. This isn't combat anymore. This is art, Weiss answered somehow, hearing them despite the distance. His voice carried an almost dreamy quality now. Every canvas needs proper preparation. Every message needs the right medium. His bloody hands caressed the dead soldier's face. Voss taught me that. In the laboratory, in the grave. Now I'm teaching it back to him. Enough, Hawthorne commanded, but the word carried no weight anymore. They all knew who was really in control now. No, Captain. Weiss's smile was radiant, beatific, terrifying. Not nearly enough. Not yet. He turned his face to the sky, letting snowflakes mix with the blood on his skin. Can you hear them running, Voss? Can you hear their boots in the snow, the rhythm of their panic? His voice rose to a shout. Are you watching? Are you learning? Sir, Gunnar whispered, we need to put him down. Now. Before what, Corporal? Weiss was suddenly beside them, moving faster than should be possible. Before I finish my work? Before I show Voss exactly what his perfect soldier can do? He gestured at the forest around them, at the bodies arranged in terrible tableaus. This is just the first act, the overture, the real performance. His eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. That comes next. The sound of German vehicles starting, up-carried through the night, Voss's men breaking contact, trying to escape. In the distance, they could see headlights moving through the trees. Let them go, Hawthorne ordered. We've done enough. We need to. No. The single word carried absolute authority. They don't get to leave, not until Voss understands. Not until he sees exactly what he created in that laboratory. Weiss's head cocked like a curious predator. Did you know a human body has over 300 arteries and veins that can be severed non-fatally? I learned that from him. Let me show you. He was gone before anyone could stop him, moving through the darkness with terrible purpose. The screams began again almost immediately. What have we done? Cooper whispered. What did we let loose? Hawthorne watched Weiss work, understanding finally dawning. They hadn't allied themselves with a soldier, or even a monster. They'd allied themselves with something worse. An artist who painted in blood. A poet who wrote in death. A creature that had learned its craft from the very worst humanity had to offer. And his masterpiece was just beginning. They found shelter in the burnt-out hulk of a German transport truck, its cargo bed still smoking from a direct hit. The Marines collapsed into exhausted heaps, tending wounds, reloading weapons, trying not to think about what they'd just witnessed in the forest, about what they'd helped create. Weiss stood apart, staring at something in the distance that only he could see. His uniform was soaked in blood, German blood, fresh kills that he wore like medals of honor. But something had changed in him. The mechanical precision was cracking, revealing something worse underneath. The hunting lodge is 3 kilometers northeast, he announced suddenly, his voice carrying that dreamy quality again. Voss's last refuge. I know every room, every corridor, every shadow. His hands moved in the air, mapping invisible architectures. I designed the security protocols myself before they made me better. We're not attacking a command post, Hawthorne said firmly. We've got wounded. We need to run? Weiss turned to face them, and his eyes held something new. A fever, a hunger that went beyond mere killing. Hide? How long before he sends more men? Better men? How long before he finds you? His laugh was edged with madness. He never stops hunting, never stops experimenting. There are more laboratories, more subjects, more perfect soldiers waiting to be born. You see what he's doing? Gunnar exploded, rounding on Hawthorne. You see what he's turning us into? We're not soldiers anymore, we're just tools. His instruments. You don't have to come. Weiss's voice was almost gentle. Take your wounded. Go home. Tell yourself pretty lies about survival and necessity. His smile was terrible to behold. But ask yourself this. When Voss finds you again, when his next perfect soldier comes hunting, who will save you then? Doc spoke up from where he was treating Cooper's shoulder wound. Sir, we're in no shape for an assault. Half our ammunition is gone. We've got 3 men who can barely walk. Then they crawl, Weiss snapped. They crawl or they die. Those are the only choices left. Now, a distant explosion lit up the night. Voss's men destroying their own equipment, burning documents, preparing for a final stand. Through his binoculars, Hawthorne could see the hunting lodge, its windows glowing with artificial light. A fortress in the darkness. He's calling for reinforcements, Weiss observed casually. But no one is coming. His men have already spread the word. The monster has returned. The perfect soldier is hunting his maker. That awful smile again. Who would stand against that? Hawthorne studied his men's faces, exhausted, haunted, but still looking to him for leadership. Even now, after everything they'd seen, they trusted him to make the right choice. But what was right anymore? Then he saw it. Weiss had drawn his knife and was carefully, deliberately carving something into his own arm. German words, cut deep enough to bleed but precise enough to be legible. Tod ist nur der Anfang. Death is only the beginning. Last chance, Captain, Weiss said softly, not looking up from his bloody work. You can run from this, run from me. But you'll never run far enough. Voss will find you. He'll send others like me. Better than me. The knife dug deeper. Or you can end it. Here. Now. Make sure he never creates another monster. Gunner's hand tightened on his weapon. Sir, we can't trust him. Whatever he is, whatever they made. Him. He's not doing this for us. He's not even doing it for revenge anymore. This is something else. Yes, Weiss agreed simply. This is art. This is poetry. This is the lesson every creator must learn. Sometimes your creations turn on you. He turned to face the lodge, and for a moment his outline seemed to blur, to become something older, something that had walked battlefields since the First War began. Sometimes they come home. Hawthorne looked at his men one last time. They were Marines. They'd sworn to fight monsters. But what happened when the monster was on your side? What happened when it wore a human face and spoke with a human voice, but its eyes held nothing human at all? We go in, he decided finally. We finish this. But afterward... He met Weiss's empty gaze. Afterward, we're done. Whatever you are, whatever you're becoming, we're not part of it anymore. Agreed. Weiss was already moving, his movements taking on that familiar, predatory grace. But first, let me show you what a perfect soldier can really do. Let me show you what fear tastes like when it has nowhere left to hide. They followed him into the darkness, toward the glowing windows of Voss's last stronghold. But with every step, Hawthorne felt it. They weren't just walking into battle. They were walking into an execution, and the executioner was already writing his masterpiece in blood. The hunting lodge loomed against the star-filled sky like a mouthful of dying light. The remaining German defenders had barricaded themselves, inside, but their sporadic fire lacked conviction. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were witnesses waiting for the executioner. Weiss moved up the slope like winter itself, cold, implacable, inevitable. His eyes had gone completely empty now, as if whatever fragment of humanity he'd been clinging to had finally frozen solid and shattered. 3 minutes, he announced in that mechanical voice. Hawthorne, take the east wing. Gunner, west. Anyone. You find... A pause. Make it clean. He's mine. The assault, when it came, was brutally efficient. The Marines' training, combined with Weiss's intimate knowledge of the lodge's layout, made it less of a battle and more of a harvest. German soldiers died in mid-sentence, in mid-breath, their bodies falling like forgotten props in someone else's play. But Weiss was something else entirely now. He flowed through the lodge like smoke, like memory, like death itself given form. Each kill was precisely calculated, positioned, arranged, a message written in cooling flesh and congealing blood. Clear right, Gunner's voice echoed through empty corridors. Clear left, Hawthorne responded, trying not to look too closely at what Weiss had left in his wake. They converged on the main hall together, boots crunching on broken glass and spent brass. And there, waiting at the far end like an actor on his mark, stood Hauptmann Erich Voss. 2 officers flanked him, their hands steady on their weapons but their eyes betraying their fear. Ah, Karl. Voss's voice carried an almost paternal tone. My perfect soldier returns home at last. Weiss stepped into the light, and something about him had changed. His outline seemed to blur, to shift, as if reality itself couldn't quite contain what he'd become. Home? The word fell from his lips, like a frozen thing. Is that what this is, Herr Hauptmann? Home? His laugh held no humor, no warmth, no humanity. Show them what you did to make me perfect. Voss's smile widened. You still don't understand, do you? Look at yourself. Look at what you've become. He gestured at the trail of artfully arranged corpses Weiss had left through the lodge. The precision, the creativity, the absolute dedication to the craft of death. You're exactly what we made you. Sir, Hawthorne stepped forward, his Thompson raised. This ends now. We take him prisoner, let proper authorities. No. Weiss's hand moved faster than thought. 2 shots, 2 bodies. Voss's officers collapsed. With mechanical precision, their heads turned to red mist. This was never about justice, Captain. This was about education, about art, about showing the Creator exactly what he created. Weiss. Hawthorne's voice held command, held authority, held everything that had once mattered. Stand down, that's an order. But Weiss wasn't listening anymore. He drew his knife, the same knife he'd used to carve messages into his own flesh. Do you remember this blade, Herr Hauptmann? Do you remember how many times you used it in the laboratory, how many lessons you taught? Voss didn't run, didn't beg. Instead, he laughed, a sound of pure, terrible understanding. You think this ends with me? There are other laboratories, other subjects, other perfect soldiers waiting to be born. You're not an ending, Carl. You're a prototype. Weiss moved like liquid shadow. Voss fought back with desperate skill, but it was like trying to fight a nightmare. The knife found him again and again, each cut precisely placed, carefully measured. This wasn't combat. It was surgery. It was art. Gunnar turned away, but he couldn't block out the sounds. Couldn't unhear Weiss's voice as he worked. The subclavian artery first, just like you taught me. Then the brachial, the femoral. So many beautiful pieces to take apart. When it was finally over, when Voss's last breath rattled out across the blood-slick floor, Weiss didn't stop. He kept cutting, kept arranging, kept creating his masterpiece of meat and bone and cooling flesh. Jesus Christ, Cooper whispered from the doorway. What did we do? What did we help make? Hawthorne watched as Weiss finally stood, his uniform soaked crimson, his eyes holding something that went beyond madness, beyond revenge, beyond anything human. It's done, the thing that had been Carl Weiss announced quietly. The lesson is complete. Behind them, the lodge had caught fire, whether from combat or by design, none of them knew. The flames painted everything in shades of hell. But Weiss didn't celebrate, didn't exult in his victory. He simply stood there, staring into the fire with those empty eyes, as if seeing something in the flames that no living man was meant to comprehend. And Hawthorne knew with cold certainty that they hadn't just witnessed revenge, they'd witnessed birth. The perfect soldier had finally truly been born. The lodge burned like a funeral pyre against the winter sky, its windows weeping flame, its timber bones cracking in the heat. The Marines gathered in the blood-stained snow, tending wounds, checking ammunition, trying not to look too closely at what remained of Voss in the great hall. But Weiss just stood there staring into the inferno with those empty eyes, as if searching for something in the flames that only he could see. We need to move, Hawthorne ordered, his voice rough from smoke and exhaustion. German. Patrols will have seen the fire. We're too deep in their territory to go. Weiss didn't turn around. His voice carried that same mechanical calm, but something had changed. Something had broken. Your war is over. Like hell. Gunnar stepped forward, his machine gun ready but not quite aimed at Weiss. Not yet. What are you planning? What else did you do to this place? A distant smile touched Weiss's blood-stained face. Did you think Voss was the only one? The only monster wearing a German uniform? There are other laboratories, other experiments, other perfect soldiers waiting to be born. His hands moved almost tenderly over the lodge's outer wall. They'll come to investigate, to recover what's left, to learn what happened to their precious project. Christ, Cooper whispered. You rigged the whole place. Of course. Weiss's smile widened slightly. Every support beam, every load-bearing wall, enough explosives to turn this entire hilltop into a crater. When the next wave arrives, when They're all inside, searching for answers. He made a soft gesture like a conductor preparing his orchestra. Bang. You're coming with us, Hawthorne said firmly. That's an order. For the first time, Weiss laughed. The sound held no humor, no warmth, no humanity at all. Orders? I died following orders, Captain. I died strapped to a table while good German doctors cut pieces out of me to see what would grow back. I died in a mass grave with 19 other failed experiments. He turned finally, and his eyes held something worse than madness. And now that Voss is dead, now that my revenge is complete, do you know what I feel? Nothing, Gunnar answered quietly. You feel nothing at all. Exactly, Weiss nodded, almost grateful. The perfect soldier, you see? No fear, no hesitation, no mercy, just the mission, always the mission. His hand touched his chest where his heart should have been beating. They burned everything human out of me. And now? He gestured at the flames. Now I return the favor. You're not a martyr, Hawthorne argued. You're just prolonging the war inside you. There's nothing left to— Listen, Weiss held up one bloody hand. In the distance, engines growled in the darkness. German vehicles approaching fast. They're coming, right on schedule. Weiss, you're free now. He was already moving toward the burning lodge, his outline blurring in the heat haze. Free from Voss, free from me, free from whatever I've become. He paused at the doorway, flames licking at his uniform but never quite touching him. Go home, Captain. Go home and forget what you saw here. Forget what war can make of a man. Forget what happens when the perfect soldier comes home to roost. He's really going to do it, Doc said softly. He's going to seal himself inside with the explosives. Wait for them to come to him. Not seal himself inside, Gunnar corrected grimly. Seal himself in with them. Make sure they don't leave. Make sure whatever they created dies with them. The German vehicles were closer now. Multiple trucks, heavy troop carriers by the sound. A full company at least, coming to investigate the fate of their precious experiment. Last chance, Hawthorne called out. There are other ways to end this. But Weiss was already half absorbed by the flames, his uniform smoking but his flesh unmarked. This was never about ending anything, Captain. This was about becoming, about perfection. His final smile was terrible to behold. Now go. Let me show them exactly what they made. Let me give them their perfect soldier, one last time. The Marines retreated into the tree line as the first German trucks appeared on the forest road. Hawthorne watched through his binoculars as officers emerged, shouting orders, organizing search parties. They approached the lodge cautiously but with purpose, drawn to the mystery of what had happened here, drawn to their doom. The last thing Hawthorne saw before they moved out was Weiss's silhouette in the flames, arms spread wide like some terrible angel of death, waiting to embrace his creators one final time. The perfect soldier had come home, and he was going to paint his masterpiece in fire. The Marines watched from the tree line as German vehicles disgorged their troops into the burning night. Officers barked orders, men rushed to establish a perimeter, medics set up aid stations, all of them drawn to the flames like moths, unaware they were flying into an inferno crafted just for them. We should stop him, Gunnar whispered, his knuckles white on his weapon. Force him to come with us. Nobody deserves to. Look at him, Hawthorne cut him off softly. Through his binoculars, he could see Weiss moving through the lodge's burning rooms, a shadow among shadows. That's not a man anymore. That's not even a soldier. That's something else. Something that died on an operating table and came back. Wrong. The first Germans entered the lodge cautiously, weapons ready, calling out in clipped professional tones. They moved like elite troops, checking corners, maintaining proper intervals. But it didn't matter. They were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. The killing started slowly at first. A single shot here, a knife thrust there. Each death precisely calculated, positioned to draw more men in, to pull them deeper into Weiss's web of fire and shadow. The Germans' disciplined advance dissolved into confusion, then fear, then panic. Mein Gott, a voice carried through the flames. Ist überall. He's everywhere. Gunfire erupted in staccato bursts, Germans shooting at shadows, at nothing, at everything. But you couldn't kill what was already dead. You couldn't stop what had already stopped being human. "Sir," Doc spoke, quietly from behind them. "We need to move. The longer we stay—" "Wait." Hawthorne couldn't look away. This wasn't just combat anymore. This wasn't even revenge. This was something older, something primal. A predator culling its prey, an artist completing his masterpiece. Weiss's voice carried across the hilltop, calm and terrible. "Welcome home, brothers. Welcome to perfection." More screaming, more dying. The Germans tried to retreat but found every exit blocked, every escape route sealed. They were trapped in the burning lodge with something that had crawled out of their own darkest experiments. "We could have saved him," Gunnar insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "No." Hawthorne shook his head slowly. "We could have delayed this. Could have pretended he was still human, still salvageable. But you can't save someone who died months ago. You can't help a weapon find peace." The finale, when it came, was both beautiful and terrible. Weiss had positioned himself in the Great Hall, the same room where Voss had died. As the remaining Germans converged on his position, his voice echoed one last time through the burning night. "Für das Vaterland." For the fatherland. But the words carried bitter mockery, a final curse against everything they had made him become. The explosion turned night into day. The lodge didn't just collapse, it disintegrated, tons of burning timber and stone imploding, with mathematical precision. Weiss had calculated every charge, every load-bearing point, ensuring the entire structure would become one massive tomb. The sound was like the end of the world. Even at their distance, the Marines were thrown to the ground by the concussion. When they looked up, the hilltop had become a crater of flame and ruin. Nothing could have survived that inferno. Nothing human, anyway. "Come on," Hawthorne ordered finally. "We need to move. Whatever Weiss was, his war is over." They disappeared into the dark forest, leaving behind the pyre of Weiss's final statement. But as they moved out, Gunnar asked the question they were all thinking. "What do we tell them, sir, about what happened here, about what we saw?" Hawthorne thought about Weiss, about the man he'd been, the weapon he'd become, the monster he'd chosen to be in the end. "We tell them the truth. We tell them that some weapons can't be controlled, some soldiers can't be saved." He paused. "And some wars don't end. They just change shape." Behind them, the flames reached for the stars, as if trying to burn away the very memory of what had happened here. But you couldn't burn away truth. You couldn't erase the knowledge that somewhere in those flames the perfect soldier had finally found his peace. In death, in fire, in one last act of terrible, perfect violence. The snow fell endlessly, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they made them. Nature itself seemed eager to forget what had happened on that burning hilltop, to bury the memory of the perfect soldier and his final masterpiece. But the Marines couldn't forget, wouldn't forget. They found the farmhouse just before dawn, a simple stone structure with a collapsed barn and an overgrown orchard. The windows were intact, the door still on its hinges. No signs of combat, no bodies, just empty rooms filled with dust and shadows. 2-hour rest, Hawthorne ordered, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Command felt hollow now after watching real power at work, after seeing what absolute control truly meant. The Marines settled into defensive positions out of habit, but there was no enemy left to fight. The Germans who had survived Weiss's campaign would spread the word. This sector was cursed, haunted. Best to let the dead keep their own counsel. Gunnar sat by a window, his machine gun across his knees, staring at nothing. Did we just follow a madman into hell? The question came out barely above a whisper, but it filled the room like thunder. No one answered immediately. What could they say? How could they explain what they'd witnessed, what they'd been part of? Finally, Doc spoke from where he lay propped against a wall, still pale from blood loss. Weiss saved us. But that doesn't make him a good man. The medic's hands shook slightly as he changed his own bandages. I've seen men break in combat, seen them lose their humanity piece by piece. But Weiss was something else, something that had its humanity cut out surgically, deliberately. He didn't just kill the enemy, Hawthorne said quietly. He became the war itself. Every dark thing we carry inside us, every monster we pretend isn't there when we look in the mirror, he embraced it all, made it perfect. Cooper, keeping watch at the back door, shuddered. Did you see how the Germans looked at him? Not just afraid, terrified, like they knew exactly what he was, what they'd created. Because he was worse than them. Gunnar finished. Worse than Voss. Worse than the SS. Worse than all of it. Because he was what they wanted to be, what they tried to make, and it turned on them. He laughed bitterly. I hated him, still hate him. But we're alive because of him. Are we? Johnson asked softly. Are we really alive? Or did something in us die back there, watching him work? Watching what a perfect soldier really looks like? Hawthorne moved to check their ammunition, their supplies, trying to focus on practical matters. But his hands froze as they found something tucked into his gear, a folded piece of paper, stained with blood that hadn't quite dried. The others watched as he opened it slowly, carefully, as if it might bite. Weiss's handwriting was exactly what you'd expect, precise, mechanical, each letter formed with surgical care. You are free now. Don't waste it. What does that mean? Cooper asked. Free from what? From him, Doc answered. From what he represented. From the knowledge that something like him could exist. The medic struggled to sit up straighter. We still have a mission. We still have to make it home. Home. Gunnar tasted the word like something foreign. How do you go home after seeing something like that? How do you pretend the world makes sense anymore? Hawthorne carefully folded the note and tucked it away. We go on. We survive. We remember. He checked his watch. 1 hour left, then we move. Stay sharp. But as the Marines settled back into their positions, as the snow continued to fall outside, none of them could shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. They had looked into the abyss of what war could create, what men could become, and the abyss had looked back with Weiss's empty eyes. They were alive, yes. They were free. But some prices are too high, even for survival. Some memories don't fade. Some ghosts don't rest. And somewhere in the falling snow, in the darkness between thoughts, the perfect soldier's legacy lived on. A warning, a promise, a reminder that the real monsters aren't born. They're made. American voices carried on the morning wind. Proper. English. Familiar accents, the sound of home. The surviving Marines stumbled toward the checkpoint, their uniforms caked with blood and snow, their eyes holding shadows deeper than mere exhaustion. The processing was mechanical, routine. Name, rank, unit. A brief medical examination. Paperwork filled out in triplicate. Everything normal, everything by the book. Until they tried to explain what had happened. Unknown number of enemy casualties, Hawthorne reported carefully, watching the clerk's pencil scratch across paper. Encountered resistance, made it through with help from local assets. The official report would say nothing of Weiss, nothing of the perfect soldier who had led them through hell, nothing of what they had witnessed in that burning lodge. Some stories couldn't be told, some truths couldn't be spoken. What happens now? Gunnar asked later, as they sat in the recovery ward. His voice carried an edge of something close to panic. We just go back, pretend everything's normal? Doc looked up from where he was finally getting proper treatment for his wounds. We go home, he said simply. But the words rang hollow, empty. Cooper laughed, a broken sound. Home? After what we saw? After what we did? He shook his head. How do you go home when you've looked into the eyes of something like that? When you've helped it complete its mission? You don't. Johnson answered quietly. You just pretend. You smile at the right times, laugh at the right jokes, act like you still belong in the world of the living. His hands shook slightly as he lit a cigarette. But part of you stays there in those woods in that lodge watching him work. Hawthorne stood at the ward's window, looking back toward the Ardennes. Smoke still rose from the forest in places. The aftermath of Weiss's final statement still burning, still speaking to those who knew how to listen. A nurse approached, clipboard in hand. Sir, we need your signature on... He didn't need saving, Hawthorne said suddenly, not turning around. None of us did. That's what we got wrong. We thought we were following him to survival, but we were really following him to understanding. Understanding what, sir? Gunner asked. What war really is. What it really does to men. Hawthorne's reflection stared back at him from the window glass, and for a moment he thought he saw Weiss's empty eyes looking through his own. It doesn't just kill us, it changes us, transforms us, makes us into something else. Into monsters? Doc suggested. No. Hawthorne shook his head slowly. Into perfect soldiers, into weapons that don't stop fighting even after the war ends, even after we die. The nurse had backed away, perhaps sensing something wrong in their conversation, something damaged in their 1,000-yard stares. She would report it later: combat fatigue, shell shock, the usual terms for men who had seen too much. But how could you diagnose the truth? How could you treat the knowledge that monsters were real, that they wore human faces, that they could be both savior and destroyer in the same breath? We survived, Gunner said, but his voice suggested this wasn't necessarily a good thing. Did we? Johnson asked. Or did we just become something else? Something that looks alive but isn't really? Like him? The ward fell silent. Outside, life went on. The war machinery continued to turn. Fresh troops arrived as veterans departed. The great wheel of violence spun on its eternal axis. But in that quiet room, in that moment of shared understanding, the Marines knew the truth. They had survived, yes, they would go home, yes, but home wasn't home anymore. The world wasn't the world anymore. Not after what they had seen. Not after what they had helped create. Hawthorne turned finally from the window, his voice barely a whisper. You were right, Weiss, we were never meant to make it home. Not really. Not after becoming part of your masterpiece. The smoke continued to rise from the distant forest, carrying with it the memory of the perfect soldier and his terrible art. The war would end, eventually. The guns would fall silent. The world would move on. But some battles never cease. Some soldiers never stop fighting. Some ghosts never die. They just perfect their craft in silence, waiting for the next war to begin. The bar was quiet for a Thursday night. 1952, and the world had moved on to new wars, new nightmares. But old soldiers still gathered here, sharing stories in low voices, keeping their demons company in the shadows between last call and dawn. Hawthorne nursed his whiskey, listening to the veteran at the next table tell his tale. The man wore a German accent thick with drink and memory. Wait, they said he was one of ours once, an officer. The perfect soldier, they called him. But something went wrong in the experiments. He died. Or should have died. The German's hands shook slightly. In the Ardennes during the last winter, he came back. Hunting. Always hunting. Urban legend, someone scoffed. Ghost stories to scare recruits. But the German's eyes held a familiar darkness. The look of a man who had seen too much, who knew too well what lurked in the spaces between reality and nightmare. My cousin was there, he continued, in the SS Medical Corps. Said they found whole squads just dead. No wounds, no fighting, like they died of fright. And the bodies. He swallowed hard, arranged, posed, like artwork. Hawthorne's hand tightened on his glass. In his mind, he saw it again. Weiss moving through the burning lodge, each kill precise, each death a brushstroke in his masterpiece of violence. They cornered him finally, the German went on, in an old hunting lodge, trapped him inside. But he, A pause. He had rigged the whole place, waited for them to come to him. Dozens of men went in. None came out, just fire and screaming and, "Enough," someone said. "War's over. Let the dead rest." But Hawthorne knew better. The dead didn't rest. Not all of them. Not the ones who had perfected death itself, who had turned violence into art, who had transcended mere survival to become something else entirely. He remembered that final moment. Weiss standing in the doorway of the burning lodge, arms spread wide, welcoming the flames like old friends. The look in his eyes hadn't been fear or hatred or even madness. It had been satisfaction, the contentment of an artist completing his life's work. Hawthorne paid his tab and stepped out into the night. Snow was falling, the first of the season, fat flakes drifting like ash in the streetlights, just like that night in the Ardennes. Movement caught his eye, a shadow among shadows, a figure standing perfectly still in the alley across the street. For a moment, just a moment, he saw that familiar outline, that mechanical grace, those empty eyes that held nothing human at all. Then the snow thickened, and the figure was gone, if it had ever been there at all. But Hawthorne knew the truth. Some men died in war, became statistics, became fading memories. Others became legends, ghost stories told in bars by trembling veterans. But Weiss had become something else entirely. He had become perfect. The snow continued to fall as Hawthorne walked home, his footsteps leaving trails that would soon vanish beneath winter's blank canvas. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog howled. A lonely sound, hungry and cold. Or perhaps not a dog at all. The perfect soldier's art lived on. His legacy whispered in bars and nightmares in the spaces between what men could do and what they should do. The war had ended, yes. The guns had fallen silent. But somewhere out there in the cold, the ghost still walked. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.